Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, Lee Edwards of Root VC and Trae Vassallo of Defy VC. Lee, Trae, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on.
So we're here today to talk about hard tech, deep tech. Lee, why don't you give a brief background of how this podcast came to be and what you're most excited to get into?
Yeah, I think Root Ventures is kind of known as a hardware-focused fund by a lot of people. And so we had talked a little bit ago about kind of the nuances and specifics of hardware investing. But I think one thing that we are finding is that if you do a little bit of hardware investment, everyone just calls you kind of a hardware fund. So a majority of our companies actually are dealing with software, and a good number of them are in pure software. But I think there's some interesting similarities when you talk about how do you invest in a company where technical challenge, technical roadmap, product development, as distinct from, say, like science R&D, but when roadmap and tech are like a primary risk, what's kind of different about it? And so Trae has some great experience and stuff like this, so I thought it'd be awesome to hear her perspective as well.
Trae, from what perspective do you approach it, and how have you approached it over time? Or how's it evolved over time?
Yeah, well, and I've gotten to know Lee over, the last few years, and was super excited to see him joining Root. And obviously, I started my venture career in 2003. Before that, I was a co-founder of Good Technology, and we were an enterprise software company. We did have a bit of a hardware component, and then we had software that ran on devices. And prior to that, I was actually a mechanical engineer. And so my history was really as a product thinker, product person who had some expertise in what it took to actually build and ship hardware. And, I saw that kind of circle back around through my time at Kleiner. I was at Kleiner for 11 years, from 2003 to 2014. Through that time, I invested in everything from consumer companies to enterprise companies to a handful of companies that really did well, that happened to have a hardware component. And those were Nest and Dropcam, to name at least two that people might have heard of. I think to Lee's point, a lot of people will associate, if you've done one hardware company, you must love them all. And, one of my things that I always talk a lot about is that part of the reason why, especially Dropcam, why I loved that company so much was that it is a phenomenal software company that was solving a really hard software problem. But the hardware that they used enabled them to get access to new information, new data that wasn't previously accessible. And so it created a moat that gave them the ability to build this incredible software company and change how, users interacted with cameras in the home in a really interesting way. And the amount of hardware risk they were taking was actually relatively minimal because they were using a commodity product, and they were able to start with a sort of a dialed in commodity product, but then make it better and push the limits of those cameras over time in a really kind of nice way. And so, when you think about hardware and venture investing, it doesn't always have to be crazy, risky, deep R&D sort of stuff either.
You mentioned that if you do a couple hardware deals, you're now the hardware investor of record. Is it because other people are just not willing to take that risk? And I'm curious if that's always been the case, or if that has been a sudden fall recently. And if so, what would it take to get back to it?
Well, maybe I'll quick answer, and then Lee, you can give your thoughts. But I think part of the issue is that most firms don't like hardware, and they don't like hardware for very good reasons. You are constrained by distribution, and your margins are ultimately, going to be, slightly lower. And if you've got a problem in the field, you can't just ship an update. You have massive risks around hardware that are very different than software. And so I think part of the issue is just that there are so far fewer investors that will consider it. So I think part of it is if you have done a hardware investment or two, it just shows that you're open to a whole other set of companies that other investors may not even want to look at.
And has it always been the case, or in your 11 years at Kleiner, was that always consistent?
I think it has changed a little bit in that, when I started in the early 2000s, things like semiconductors were still really, the industry has gone through these waves of innovation, and every wave of innovation was ultimately catalyzed by a platform change. Typically a computing platform change. There were servers, or like you can go even further back, different, memories, and then different storage mechanisms, and then different types of computing platforms and tablets and then semiconductors. And so I think, when I was entering into the industry, there were a lot of investors who were expert in different types of hardware. And then through the 2000s, we had just an absolute explosion of, first of all, new investors coming into the industry, but also just the breadth with which software was revolutionizing everything. There's an app for, absolutely everything. And the app store on your phone and kind of the phone ecosystem just, I think, really tipped that balance to so much more opportunity in software than ever before.
With the rise of clearbank and alternative financing models, some people are saying things along the lines of that venture should go back to what it started doing, which is focusing on technical risk at the expense of other things that perhaps should have other financing mechanisms. What would you say to is that resonate, or would you debate that premise?
I think there's something interesting there. I mean, when you look at, if you ever have any interest in if any of the audience has any interest in reading the history of venture capital, there's a lot of cool stuff out there for people who are so inclined. But in the early days, VC was invented to be able to finance businesses that couldn't be financed otherwise. There's a really interesting book that was popular a couple of years ago that I still recommend called Financial Capital and Technological Revolutions by Carlota Perez, who's a South American economist, who basically argues that at every stage of technology innovation, pretty much since the Industrial Revolution, financial capital has innovation at the same time that technology does. And so venture capital really was underwriting these silicon-based businesses that couldn't get a bank loan. And the deals looked super different back then, right? Like you had Venrock buying half of Apple for $1 million or whatever that crazy deal was. I think it would be a little crazy to say that venture capital can't do well in other kinds of businesses, because clearly it has. I mean, there's plenty of, non-hard tech driven businesses that have done well under VC, but I think it's interesting to me how few VCs tend to want to underwrite technical risk and find themselves gravitated towards business model innovation and things like that, which again are awesome. And in my work history, I've tended to work at a lot of places like that as well. But to me, technical risk is just so exciting, and it feels like the thing that has such a high ceiling in terms of the potential.
What do you think, Trae?
I think things like, hey, we're going to help you with customer acquisition and everyone else should focus on the tech risk. I think that oversimplifies, the problem set, actually. And I do think we're living in a period of time where, customer acquisition is dominated by Google and Facebook. And, and won't stay that way forever. And so you've got a lot of businesses trying to figure out how to break through this problem set right now. But when I think about fundamentally, what is venture doing? Yes, there's the go-to-market stuff, but there's also things like building teams and people and simply scaling the internal organization. And that is separate from the tech risk, and is separate from the other sort of outsourcing of customer acquisition that you can do. And so I think you can't ignore those things. But I do agree with Lee's point in that, a lot of Silicon Valley was originally started by these sort of, breakthrough technologies. And I think the thing that seems a little bit different today is that, the barriers to entry have gotten lower. And so we see a lot more businesses that feel a lot more incremental, but where I also think there's a lot of interesting, I'd say exciting opportunities are in these areas where maybe the technology itself isn't truly breakthrough, but where you're connecting a technology that maybe has been vetted and kind of well used in a certain area with a whole nother corner and a whole nother market. And it would never found its way there except for a special team that understand the nuances of the problems in that market and the technology, from another market. And they're bringing those things together. And so, I'd say one of the big trends that I've seen today is this kind of cross-fertilization of technologies into new markets, especially as tech is truly transforming and going deep into all different markets, whether it's gov tech and ed tech and, how drugs are being discovered. All of these businesses are starting to be transformed. And, the algorithms that we might be using in a logistics company might have already been highly used in in another case, in another slightly different business, but they just haven't met before. So I also think that's another nuance that I think is also pretty exciting.
Trae, you mentioned you started doing this in 2000, which is a lot longer than Lee and I have been doing this. So I'm curious for your perspective on this hypothesis I have, which is that as technology has become much more specialized, there's been a rise of sector-specific funds and specialists. And so I'm curious how you, if I understand DeFi is a generalist fund, feel free to edit that assumption, think about how to be an expert in areas that have increasingly are becoming specialized.
Yeah, no, I think it's a super interesting question. And, I think any advice that, I give someone who's new in the industry is to find your area where you are doubling down on your core strengths so that you can get out there and get some momentum in the market. And so I do think that generally is a great set of advice and a great way to kind of kickstart your career or kickstart a fund. But the interesting thing is if you look at very specific funds that have entered the market, they do tend to generalize over time because when you're building a portfolio, one of the important things within this portfolio of companies is you do want to have the domain expertise, enough of it to make smart decisions, but you also don't want to be completely single-threaded on a particular sector that might just be out of favor in the time when these companies really start to become to sort of hit their stride. And the timing of these markets are things you can't control. And so Defy we are a generalist firm. And so part of what we do to supplement for the fact that we are not going to be the smartest people in the room on any particular topic, part of our strategy is to have a network of who we think are some of the smartest people in the world on very specific sectors. And that's part of the reason why we started our Defy Sage program. It is us basically saying, hey, we work really closely with these active CEOs who are operating in these markets, who help us analyze and then ultimately add value to portfolio companies in a way that you can't do it if you're a venture investor, because once you step out of the operating side of things, your skills, they're going to atrophy. And our expertise as investors is really in kind of the network and leveraging that network to make the smartest decisions we can.
Sounds like a good strategy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Having been at Root, we have, and I think two of the three other partners, Trae. One thing that we try to do, I definitely agree how quickly skills atrophy, especially technical skills. But we have a lot of equipment, I would say, around the office from
stay active, huh?
And yeah, exactly. And I'm writing code all the time. A lot of times for internal kind of process automation stuff. I actually have a software intern this summer. Shout out to Adam, who's from Dorm Room Fund. So yeah, I think that by essentially continuing to build and just sort of be engineers in kind of the core of our identity, we're trying to stay somewhat fresh. I think it's, that being said, it's absolutely true that, we are not the world's best engineers in any particular vertical. But it's interesting, you've somehow managed to stay up to speed with a lot of your technical skills. I was just talking to Chrissy, our partner, earlier today about a phone call we had a couple months ago doing diligence on a company where the two of you sort of broke down the bill of materials on an extremely detailed basis, costs and the components of the BOM. So Chrissy was EPM at Apple. It's Chrissy Meyer. She was working on the Apple Watch Edition 1 and iPod Touch, iPod Nano. So she's also got a strong supply chain background. So listening to that conversation, the first thing that I was thinking while the two of you were basically running, a mile a minute, oh my God. Other investors that don't have this kind of background, it would take them a lot of time to diligence something like this that I just observed happen in 3 minutes. And it gave us some really interesting insight into the conversation and the conclusions we got to. So I think we tend to view that when it comes to hard tech, having some background can be helpful. And that's, it's certainly not exclusive or absolutist statement. Obviously, some of the greatest investors and some of the most technically challenging companies have, come from finance backgrounds or have been CEOs at less technical companies. But just one way we try to sort of differentiate.
Yeah. Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the scope of what you sort of put in hard tech, deep tech. Do you want to take a stab at what sort of sub areas, does hard tech comprise?
Yeah, I think when we say hard tech, a lot of time we kind of use that word intentionally. A lot of times people immediately jump to hardware, as I mentioned, but the area that I'm focusing on looking at specifically, I call hard software. So what are the areas in software that carry a lot of technical risk that, let's say, require pretty deep engineering expertise on the team? So one example of a company in our portfolio is called Entopology. They're doing CAD software, computer-assisted design. So you can think of sort of SolidWorks Pro Engineer, AutoCAD, that kind of software. But what they're doing is a technique called generative CAD, where you can essentially create the sort of equations that govern the design constraints on the part. And the system can sort of optimize and generate solids that satisfy the equations. And so what this lets people do is design really advanced structures, say like complex internal lattice structures, and that you sort of couldn't do before or couldn't do easily. And it also kind of unlocks a lot of capability of additive manufacturing. So I'm not allowed to get specific, but if you're listening to this podcast, you have almost definitely seen one of these parts somewhere. There's a number of really great customers. So that's a pure software company. The customer happens to be a mechanical design engineer, but when we consider this hard tech.
Yeah. If 5 years from now we're coming back on this podcast and every venture capital firm is getting into hard tech, sort of all the rage, like what is most likely happened? Like why would that be true? Like where would the big companies come from?
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll throw out a couple of thoughts. So, part of what I've been looking at is companies that are enabling maybe the hardware ecosystems to sort of evolve in a way that's parallel to what we've seen happen with the software world. And so the interesting thing is if you look at, how developing, just take any kind of web-based company or app-based company, back in the, early 2000s, late 90s, people had to build their servers, then launch their app, and every little part of that infrastructure they had to do themselves. And gradually, things like AWS and all of these other tools have made launching a website something that, my high schooler can do successfully. And when you look at the hardware side of the world, to Lee's point about one of the incredible tools his portfolio is working on, a lot of these things still have to be homegrown and done internally. Even things, recently I've been looking at, some of these marketplaces around just simply matching, the makers with the builders, whether it's like the Fictives of the world or some of these other companies out there. There are so many places where, again, taking sort of software and ecosystems that we know how to build in other places, getting the timing right, and then figuring out how to launch those into, the hardware side of the world. I think it's going to look dramatically, what it takes to actually build, a device from scratch is going to look dramatically different in 5 years than it does today.
Yeah, I that's something we definitely talk about a lot. One of our early companies is called Particle, that essentially tries to bring hardware.
I'm a huge fan of Particle. They're awesome. Yeah,
glad to hear that. Yeah. So another trend that I think is interesting, kind of similarly, is again kind of looking at how software developers build software. Andrew Ng recently had a tweet saying that data science and data engineering tools are a ghetto, which is something I've been saying for a long time, but he said it sort of more succinctly and with a lot more expertise behind it. But if you think about the way that, exactly as you described, I think data engineering tools to me feel like mechanical CAD tools did back when I was a mechanical design engineer like a decade ago. PLMs were kind of the state of the art of how you maintain internal systems of record and how you collaborate on files. But at the end of the day, many companies, including the one that I was at, would have Windows file folders full of final _1 actually final _2, whatever. And you see that with like Jupyter notebooks in most companies. And you certainly see that with production databases and data warehouses and data pipelines and ETL tasks. And the other reason I think this might be a really interesting trend is it feels like when you talk to people that deal with this stuff, they know it's a pain point. And they basically say, I don't know how else you solve it, really. It just kind of works. We work around it. It kind of works.
Right.
That to me, that either that's true or there's a real opportunity here that's kind of non-obvious, but someone with kind of the right ideas. And I've seen a few companies that are tackling this. But yeah, I'm definitely a big believer that looking at the model of how software is developed and applying that to other kinds of creators, inventors, engineers, artists, innovators, it's just about reducing friction and tightening feedback loops.
Yeah, you actually reminded me. So I caught up with a friend, Joe DeSimone, who's the founder of Carbon, which is one of these additive 3D companies. And got the kind of most recent tour and saw the stuff that they're working on. And these guys are actually building, they've got a deal with Adidas and they're building really cool, soles of shoes and their dental industry is on fire. And the conversation that was so inspiring to me is how, if you look at how much the tools and the processes restrict the creativity. And, with a company that you were talking about, like all these new tools and all these new ways to make things actually opens up the possibility of making things that we couldn't ever make before because it was just impossible because of the tools. And so that's a whole nother level of, stuff is also dramatically changing and is also really, really hard.
Totally. And to circle back to the idea of, certain kinds of investors and investing in certain kinds of things, Trae, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to about entopology who have just sort of not really understood what I meant.
Mm-hmm.
You can't design this. Because design for manufacture is not something everyone takes, right?
Right, exactly.
You know what it means to, can you make this with a ball end mill? Are there undercuts? Is your draft angle big enough? Like all these questions that go away in additive manufacturing. It can be hard. I think that it takes the kind of investor who understands that stuff to understand, those are problems that even need to be solved.
That's right.
Let's talk about robotics a little bit. Lee, perhaps you could define how you think about what robotics is and how people should think about it, and then where you're excited there.
Yeah. So the definition of robotics feels like one of the oldest conversations in technology, or especially people that work in robotics. But I tend to think of it as some kind of machine that does an automated task that relieves human labor. I did not invent this, and I don't remember where to attribute it to, but I absolutely love it, that the washing machine is the most successful robot ever created, because it basically freed half of the world's population. There's one in every home, the number of hours it saves is insane. So I think whether robots are telepresence oriented or autonomous is kind of up for your own definition. But one area that I find super exciting in robotics that centers around software is if you look at some of the research OpenAI put out around the grasping manipulator, there's a few really interesting technologies that powered that. One is the sort of use of simulations to train machine learning models. And this is beyond robotics, but has a particularly great application in robotics, where instead of having some physical hardware in a bunch of different labs in a bunch of different environments, if you can create an accurate enough simulation, you can create meaningful training data that will train models, either say computer vision models or anything like that, to make the robot make sort of more intelligent decisions. And partly that's enabled by the proliferation of really high-powered GPUs and other kinds of compute on the edge and low-latency connectivity to the cloud. These are things when I was at iRobot in 2007 was when I joined. We had a Pentium 2 on the robot that I worked on. So training machine learning models was not something we were going to be doing. But yeah, I think that to me it feels so early in terms of how we're applying machine learning and AI and computer vision to robotics.
So where are you looking at venture opportunities in this space?
So we love automation in industries that we feel are overlooked. I think this is another area where people don't often think about agriculture, warehouses, fulfillment centers, shipping, logistics, all these kinds of things. And so Kane Shea at our firm is really deep into industrial automation. I think that's certainly one area that you can see kind of the macroeconomic tailwinds for why industrial automation has a time to exist now, with the cost of labor going up, with full employment happening, with lots of trends you're seeing in this country. You're also seeing elsewhere in the UK. Immigration policy, things like this are really impacting the cost of how things get made. So yeah, I love taking a look at that. I mean, we've certainly have at least one consumer hardware company, depending on how you define it. But we find that our wheelhouse is to really look at, what's under the surface of what runs the economy.
Trae, how do you view the space and how do you view opportunities within it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's hard to add much to what Lee said. I think when people do think about robotics, they often tend to think of, purely industrial robots. And I do think that it's I always thought of the Nest thermostat. I was involved in Nest, and I always thought of that as a robot because effectively you're sensing and you're taking action on behalf of somebody. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be mobile, but it has to be sensing. It has to be automated in some intelligent way. And that kind of opens the universe up quite broadly. I think the thing that's interesting is that the opportunities to bring kind of robotics into a lot of industry is really big, but the problem that's facing at least the venture industry is these are customers and customer sets that most venture folks don't know very well. And if I look at where, the venture industry is messed up in the past, where a lot of money has gone in and not a lot of great returns have happened, have often been in areas where the technology might be really cool and work really well, but assumptions around how those businesses scale, grow, adopt technology might be wrong. And so, I'd say this is one of these areas where, at least at Defy, we're spending a fair amount of time getting smart, but also recognize that, warehouses, for example, it's not a market that we know as well as we need to. And so, that is one of those areas where, we need to strengthen the set of experts in our ecosystem. And I love Lee's point about, kind of bringing technology to areas that may seem less exciting or kind of, maybe not everybody's focused on it. We love those things too. And in fact, logistics is one of those areas where it's one of our most exciting companies is in the logistics sector. And it was a great example. It's not robotics, but it is more of, bringing, information tech and kind of marketplace tech into this area in a clever way. And so I think the point there was that there are a lot of these industries, whether it's robotics or even software, where the time is now to start deploying some really great technology that, can drive a lot of business opportunities.
Yeah, and thinking back to the question of the other interesting trends, something Trae said earlier about how great companies can come out of the sort of why now of hardware developments. I think one trend that we talk about a lot, we talk about the phrase "the peace dividends of smartphone wars" is something people talk about a lot.
Yeah, love it.
Totally. It's like the existence of GPS antennas, right? Which even the GPS antenna and module itself has gone down a huge amount in cost. The availability of IMUs, all the stuff, edge compute. But we talk about the peace dividends of the smart car wars, so of the self-driving car wars as well. Yeah. Because I think, venture, I don't know how many people are sort of investing right now in venture in new self-driving car companies. It's certainly not something we've done, but we're really excited at whoever wins this thing or whichever large set of companies wins this thing. We're going to have cheap, highly capable LiDAR. There's going to be some amazing software out there. There's going to be probably lots of cool. I mean, a lot of that simulation-based training that I referred to, that's been in a lot of these companies. So even just the techniques and the talent. And if you even think about centers of talent in the U.S., like I'm excited for the startup explosion in Pittsburgh. And I think there's some really, really great stuff coming out of that as a trend.
Yeah, Lee, you made me think of two things. One is that we always love to look at an industry that's, there's clearly a lot of change, like autonomy, and try to figure out what's an orthogonal way to view that industry that might be an interesting approach to making a dent in that industry that other people aren't thinking of. And an example of that around autonomy is that, we founded Defy in 2016. First fund closed in 2017. And so we kind of missed that first wave of investing in autonomy. But what we did have were some really interesting relationships with folks who really understood, 24/7 video, especially through Dropcam and Nest. And so we ended up investing in a company called Owl, which is a consumer-facing hardware company. It's starting as more aftermarket. It's basically if you wanted to put a Nest cam in your car, that's what they do. But it turns out it's hard because you don't have Wi-Fi in your car. And so you have to do a lot of local edge processing, figure out what's important, what do you alert the driver to or the owner to, because it works whether you're in the car or not. And that's really been a fascinating example of a company that we invested in where they now have over 110 million miles of driving data and real roadside data and learning data that they have through their system, through something that's not even focused on autonomy, but the data set and what they're doing actually is hugely relevant to autonomy. So I think that's also just another way to look at some of this hard tech stuff is how do you flip it on its side and maybe solve a slightly different set of problems. And in Owl's case, it's all about car security and keeping tabs on this important asset, whether you're a fleet owner or a consumer owner of a car. And then the other point I wanted to make was your point about teams in other locations. So, it's never been harder to hire an engineer in the Valley. And at least my whole experience being in tech or an investor here. And so what that means is that basically every single portfolio company that we have has an engineering team or some kind of team in a different location, often in the US. So this isn't outsourcing to Eastern Europe or some remote part of the world. This is outsourcing to Montreal or Atlanta, Georgia. And I do think that's a really fascinating new trend that does point to, in 5-10 years, you're going to have pockets of technical excellence that are going to be much more distributed than they've ever been.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A little bit of a sidebar, but to the extent that some of the hard tech we're talking about is hardware, there is at least one example of a company in our portfolio that's done this well, but it seems to me to be incredibly difficult, much more difficult to do a distributed hardware team than it is to do a distributed software team. Curious on your thoughts about that and maybe things you've seen in your portfolio as well.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I do think when you distribute the teams, they sort of have to still be in groups. And I'd say where I have seen distributed hardware teams work well is that virtually any company that I've worked with that had a team that was manufacturing a product in Asia, which is all of them, had an on-the-ground team in Asia that, where they were 100% focused on building the product for our company, but were also deeply embedded in the supplier, the manufacturer in the country they were in. Because I think where a lot of companies who are making hardware fall down is the managing the external relationships with all the service providers. Those are really, really hard, and you effectively need to implant people from your organization into those companies. So oftentimes hardware does have an Asia team and a US team, but they're two teams with heft that then know how to communicate with each other.
Lee, why don't we talk a bit about dev tools? What are sort of the trends that are making that interesting for you, and where are you excited to see opportunities within the space?
So I consider tools and services for developers to be one of the areas of hard tech that I'm really interested in. I think there are a lot of very sort of specific and technical trends. Like I think containerization in Kubernetes has definitely been around for a little bit, and I'm seeing lots and lots of companies trying to build on top of that. Also definitely seeing a lot of companies that are looking at ways to try to sort of, as I was talking about earlier, kind of improve the tool chain for data science and data engineering and make it sort of make those things kind of much more of a first-class citizen. Well, I guess the reality is that those components of the architecture already are first-class citizens, but the tooling is maybe lagging behind. I'm also really interested in, I think sometimes people can kind of overestimate how easily deployable machine learning is. A lot of times when you talk to investors and they're like, oh, well, computer vision, that's so easy these days. There's TensorFlow, and there's ImageNet. And that is true to some extent. But I'm really interested in how you sort of turn the 1X engineer, the half of developers who are below average, I would say, which I'd put myself in this bucket. How do you make these people incredibly more capable? If you look at the time when people used to build all their own CMSs and then WordPress came around and sort of raised the floor, how hard it was to sort of process credit card transactions on the internet until Stripe came around and made it doable in 6 lines. And you're constantly seeing the floor rise for what can you do. What used to be hard becomes kind of easy, and what used to be easy becomes free. And then what's the next frontier of what's difficult? I'm really interested in that ecosystem. And I think that there's always going to be a frontier like that. And it's just kind of a question of, finding the next company that wants to provide this stuff more easily, right? I think some good examples of companies I'm talking about are things like Elasticsearch, even things like PagerDuty. In the last couple of years, we've seen a ton of IPOs in kind of the $1 billion sizing, but also obviously the GitHub exit. You're seeing a lot of these big companies being very acquisitive in this space, particularly Microsoft. So yeah, I think it's a super exciting area, and I think for me it's really fun because the developer consumer, if you want to call them that, is such an interesting beast. They're not an enterprise customer. They're not really a consumer customer. They're still somewhat affected by brand. They're somewhat affected by trends. They're kind of making decisions for themselves, and they think a lot about usability. You think about like developer UX, but at the same time, they're also using these things professionally and are interested in kind of the quality and quantity of the output. Something I've been thinking about. I don't know that enough has been sort of written about thinking about, sort of business to developer as a kind of go-to-market.
Trae, how have you viewed the space and how do you view the opportunities within it today?
I can't say that we've necessarily been focused on that specifically. I think I do love Lee's point about raising the floor and things that, required, a lot of knowledge today are a couple of lines of code. I think that makes a ton of sense. So I don't know that I've got a great point of view for you specifically on tools. I do think we have been looking at a bunch of kind of product-centric things that may be less about ops, but more about how can you just look for, how your customers are using and interacting with your product and more seamlessly fold that back into your product development. Because there is such a breakdown between what happens operationally and what gets fed back into your product creation. And I'm a product person. And so I love to start with first principles around, what's the problem you're solving for your customer, and are you doing that in an efficient way? And how are we measuring that, and how can we more effectively create those feedback loops? So I do think that's an interesting area. I do want to highlight a point that Lee was making about kind of selling to this particular customer. One thing that the point of view that we have at Defy that is, I think, slightly different than some firms is that we do not see the world as consumer or enterprise. We actually think that distinction is pretty old school. And, and yes, there are companies that, it's a big old enterprise sale. But when you think about it, you do have to care a lot more about the ease of use of the product, and the people who are using the product matter a lot more in the buying of the product. And even the biggest consumer companies are ultimately enterprise sales on the back end. Facebook has an enterprise ad sales back end. And so we definitely take much more of a blended view around all of our companies that we're invested in tend to have elements of what we would call kind of direct-to-consumer strategies around how they're talking about themselves, product usability, virality, all the way through to, even OWL, which is started out as a consumer product, is doing very large enterprise sales today. And so kind of being a bit more fluid on the go-to-market and not seeing it as black and white, I do think is an important difference. Is not answering the question you asked, but was certainly catalyzed by Lee's point about, these dev folks are kind of different. They're both enterprise and consumer in many ways.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you look at especially the wave of enterprise companies that are sort of on the rise in the VC world, like I'll name drop my roommate's company, Lever, right? Partly successful because recruiters demand a good UX.
Yeah, when the person who's using the product's more responsible for the buying of it, it starts to look a lot more like a historically consumer product, right?
Trae, what other subsectors or subcategories would you put in the sort of hard tech bucket that you are excited about?
Yeah, well, so it's good timing because I'm just finishing up doing a deep dive on a space tech company. So I would definitely categorize that in this sector. And, part of why I find it so fascinating is that, it's a new emerging supply chain. So while there is a lot of new hardware and a lot of new suppliers, there are also old suppliers bridging to new software and new tech. And so I am still kind of getting the lay of the land, but I'm excited by the fact that there are some really interesting software-only opportunities. There are some very interesting, changing the business model opportunities. And then there's some very interesting fundamental we've got an interesting new piece of technology opportunities. And it's a market that, absolutely has to get bigger, and it's basically going through what was a very nationalized, government-driven industry to one that has become privatized. And so I think there's a lot of fascinating opportunity. We've not made an investment yet in the sector, but it's one where we're doing a deep dive.
Have you guys looked at space?
We haven't. As an angel investor, I had one extremely small investment in a space company. Yeah, it's something we're definitely open to.
And where are you looking within the space trade? Where do you expect to, and what part of the stack do you expect to invest or be excited about?
Yeah, so right now, based on my kind of early spending time in the industry, it's going to be less around the, hey, we've got a new kind of rocket booster thing or a piece of hardware. And it's going to be more around the integration of data and even new business models around helping customers solve a problem. Because this has been an industry where everything has been entirely verticalized. And now, again, to Lee's point about raising the floor, there are opportunities to pick off certain pieces of this ecosystem that everybody needs and do it in a much better, faster, easier way. And some of that's very software intensive, maybe with a little bit of hardware. Some of it's more pure software, but I'm sure we'll learn more as we go.
What are your y'all's requests for startups? What do you want to see entrepreneurs pursue in hard tech? What would you love to back or to see people build? Lee, do you want to start?
Yeah, I have a few. I mean, I kind of alluded to one earlier. I'd love to see someone who has a really specific, good way to destroy the Jupyter Notebook, which Jupyter Notebooks are amazing. They're so great and people love them. But I think there's some amount of learned helplessness when it comes to sort of the system of record of the data that's flowing through your company, the analysis that people have done. The state of the art at most companies seems to be emailing, pasting things into Slack, SQL queries, records, what your company's definition of a core metric like LTV, it might sit in some people's heads. To me, that feels like it's good, but not great, and someone could probably fix it. And then I'm also really interested in the applications and the tooling for some of what I think are the pieces in AI and ML that are getting very exciting very quickly, which to me, this is simulation-based training, things like small data, being able to take advantage of very, very powerful GPUs at the edge. It's kind of a broad request for startups, I suppose. Anything that turns sort of a 1x engineer into a 10x engineer or a 100x engineer, I think is another metric I use.
Trae, how about yours?
Yeah, I'd say one area that we've been digging around in a lot that I think is super hard. It involves a lot of interesting and kind of groundbreaking technology and we haven't touched on it yet, is in this kind of emerging health tech sector and how a lot of this deep technology is changing what we know about ourselves and our health. And I think this is just so important given the healthcare system, especially in the US, the incentives are so misaligned and so broken. I think the only way to truly fix it is by allowing consumers themselves or companies that enable consumers themselves to really understand and learn a lot more about their health situation and do more with it. And so specifically, things from, we've got the Apple Watch, we've got all these ways of measuring data points, but no one's used that to actually create true engaging information about what do I need to do and what should be happening. There's a whole bunch of emerging, really interesting stuff around the microbiome, which I do think is going to be next generation. A lot of the medical literature in 10 years is going to be about how important the microbiome is to our health and our mental health and our longevity. And these are all super, super hard problems that I think are incredibly fascinating. And we're definitely, paying attention to those as well.
Well, I don't think I've spoken to you, Trae, since you closed the second fund, and you were humble in not talking about it this whole time. So I wanted to congratulate you.
Thank you. Yeah, we're excited to have, we've got now a $260 million fund. And so, again, just to remind folks, we're looking for companies where we can back them. We typically write checks from 3 to 10 million. Some people might call that a Series A. Those definitions are changing. But, our whole goal is to invest early and work side by side with entrepreneurs to help them scale. So thank you, Lee. I appreciate you pointing that out. And so if anybody listening has a company they want us to learn more about, all of our contact information is easily accessible. I'm Trae at defy.vc.
Awesome. And you can learn more at defy.vc. And Lee, people can learn more at root.vc.
Yeah, so we're a hard tech focused seed fund. We tend to do checks around $1 million, and we love doing anything where technical risk is front and center, where roadmap has to be developed, and where we can kind of leverage some of our experience and also our networks and really all kinds of engineering. Kane's the kind of person who rides a motorcycle through the Andes, it breaks down and he repairs it and continues on. Chrissy was the EPM on the first Apple Watch, the first EPM on the first Apple Watch. My interest is mostly in pure software. I've been at various software companies over the last 10 years.
Lee, Trae, this has been a great episode. Thank you guys for coming on.
Thanks for the invite.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.